Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to this event with Sir James MacMillan. My name is Ian Payton. I'm the Bishop of St Andrews, Dunkeld and Dunblane in the Scottish Episcopal Church, and I've long been a fan of the music of our guest today, Sir James MacMillan. He's been described as the most successful Scottish composer ever and the most performed. His music has earned him many accolades, visceral, compelling, full of rhythmic excitement, thrilling, explosive, raw, impulsive and driven. Indeed, James, your music is all of these things. And you've been celebrating your 60th birthday just last month. And the Edinburgh Festival has been celebrating James and his music all this month. Indeed, recently he published his autobiography, A Scots Song, and there will be a signing of this book available in the signing tent immediately after this, and that's what we're here to discuss. But during the festival, there have been performances of James's Missa Brevis, his powerful, insistent work, Quickening, exploring birth and new life, and including a children's choir, and a wry, tongue-in-cheek organ concerto, a Scotch bestiary, with characters from Scottish life featured as bees, ducks, hyenas, big fish, and jackals. I won't tell you which character is which in that. But the culmination of all this was last weekend at the Usher Hall with the premiere of James's Fifth Symphony, Le Grand Inconnu, an epic choral meditation on the Holy Spirit. And it had many rave reviews. And the audience there awarded him a standing ovation. Many of you may have been at that performance. James, the premiere of your Fifth Symphony, a great work like that, what sort of emotions does a composer have at rehearsals for it and then a performance of a great piece you've worked on for so long?
Well, this was a very special piece for me. I've been working up to it for some time. Any symphony nowadays is a statement of intent. There are many composers who would not want to write symphonies, and I can understand why. It's sometimes seen as being of the past. All the great symphonies have been written already, some would argue, and all the great symphonists are dead. But I'm very much alive, or at least I was the last time I checked, and I still think that there is a validity and authenticity in at least attempting some kind of musical statement which one would call symphonic, and I've tried it in very different ways. The Fifth Symphony turned out to be a choral symphony, so it was written for two choirs and orchestra. Those two choirs were the 16, conducted by Harry Christophers. It's this wonderful English choir. I personally think they're the greatest choir in the world. And I've worked with them solidly now for some time, and I've written steadily bigger and bigger pieces for them. And then a bigger chorus, the Genesis 16, which was made up of about 40 of their young alumni from their training academy. So it was chamber choir, large symphonic choir, and orchestra. And the orchestra on Saturday night, of course, was the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, an ensemble and an organisation I've had a wonderful relationship with for over 30 years now. And to see all these different forces coming together in a work like the Fifth Symphony was a very special thing for me, and hearing the rehearsals and the lead up to it was very exciting.
It must have been amazing to hear a work you've worked on for so long. When you draw that final double bar on a work you've been working on for a very long time, what's the sensation? What feeling do you have as the creator?
Well, it's a very strange sensation that I have, because every living, waking and sleeping moment, I think, is dominated by the work at hand. You create from scratch. You're creating little fragments to begin with, little buds and pearls of sound in your imagination, but then you've got to fashion them into some kind of coherent structure, as coherent as one can hope for. And that panoply of structure and expression builds up over a period of sometimes months, sometimes years. the Fifth Symphony took about 8 or 9 months to write. So you live with it continually. But when you come to put the double bar at the end of the piece, and in a sense everything is settled and everything is written and everything is submitted onto the page, at least in my mind, something very strange happens. It's as if something evaporates immediately. All these thoughts, all these structures, all these ideas that have kept your brain active and alive for so long just disappear completely. It's literally in an instant, which is very odd and it's quite discomforting sometimes, but it's a necessary disappearance, a necessary evaporation, because the mind, the soul, the heart has to move on and has to move on to the next set of fragments and buds and things. And just to prove what it's like, when I come to, and I conduct a lot of my own music, when I come to eventually conduct these works, maybe a couple of years down the line, it's like learning a new piece of music, an unknown piece of music from scratch.
Yes.
I have no recollection of having written it. I don't remember writing it, and it's like reading someone else's music, and one has to go about it objectively in the way that you would learn any other person's music, and that is an odd feeling. Obviously, when I come to hear the music and perform my own music, I can say, yes, of course it's me, but it's a very strange and I would say mysterious aspect of the world of inspiration and the world of the imagination, that all that just can disappear in an instant.
Do you feel to be a composer, do you have to be inspired, whatever the individual means by that?
I think so. To write the music that I want to write, I need to be inspired, in the sense that I could never imagine physically trying to write music I didn't want to write. Now, there's a little aside to that, because I know that sometimes there are instances, maybe it's happened to me, but I know that if one is serving another art form, for example, and I know that many of my colleagues write music for film or television, or they have to be at the beck and call of another directorial force, as it were. And the inspiration there is very different, I think. It's more collaborative. It's intense in its own ways, but for me it is all-encompassing. It's my personality, it's my own soul that is working out and has to be given full vent, and therefore the inspiration has to be acute in every way. And one hopes that the inspiration is there. You were asking earlier about writer's block. Is there such a thing in a composer's life? Well, there is actually, and I haven't had it for a while, but I know that some of my younger colleagues, especially students, suffer from it, and they express their anxieties about it, and they ask me about it. What I say to them is that the inspiration doesn't disappear, it doesn't desert you, it just goes underground. It becomes subliminal, it can become subconscious, and it means that it is working in a different way. And once one realizes that, one can cope with the silences, the apparent emptiness, the apparent absences in one's thoughts or in one's aspirations and inspirations, because the inspiration, the muse, if you like, the spirit, is there while you sleep and you don't notice it. And it works in mysterious ways, and it waits. You've got to be patient, because the inspiration will find its own pattern of work.
You've spent your life expressing that inspiration and expressing yourself in music. And I wonder how it feels to have expressed yourself in a very personal way in this little book that you've written. How does it feel to be expressing yourself in words now?
Very strange. I'm completely out of my comfort zone here today. I'm used to being on stages with orchestras and other musicians, but to be talking about books is very different. I come to these events and I love hearing hearing authors speak. There's one in particular mentioned in the book, a poet, Michael Simmons Roberts. I know we'll talk about him later, who's I collaborate with a lot, and he writes these beautiful sacred poems for our secular times, if you like, and I love coming to hear people at him talk. So for me to be talking about my words rather than my music is very odd. But Hugh Andrew of Berlin asked me late last year if I had considered putting down some reflections about my music and other aspects of my life. I do write a lot of articles. I've written for newspapers and for publications, and I suppose my mind has always geared towards the wider context, the extra musical, what inspires the music, where does the music come from, our musical culture, our political culture that inspires arts and music. All these things are something I have spent my whole life thinking about. And I thought it might be a unique opportunity to mark my 60th birthday to get some of them down on paper like this. And although there is a kind of little autobiographical thread through the work, it talks about my childhood and recent events and right through, I just use those autobiographical events as jumping off points into bigger subjects like music history, musical history, and religion and spirituality and other things.
Before you read to us a passage you've chosen from the book, could I just ask whether you felt that writing the book, the process of writing the book, felt anything like the process of writing the music?
No,
right.
It didn't. It felt very different and enjoyable in a very different way. A kind of palate cleanser. I mean, I've always regarded my writing of words as a kind of palate cleanser, or at least a brain cleanser. It cleans something out and perhaps allows you to get your thoughts refreshed in some way, and I felt very much like that with this book.
Well, James, would you like to read to us a part of the book?
Yes, there's a little passage I'd like to read, mainly because it's about Edinburgh. I'm very much from the West, not exactly a Ouija, as you say over here, but I spent many, various decades in Glasgow, brought my children up there, but I'm very much from the west of Scotland. And we'll talk about East Ayrshire, because it was a very important place for me growing up, and my family were important to me. My grandfather was a coal miner who was a euphonium player and sang in his local church choir, and he got me my first cornet and all the rest of it. So the west of Scotland and the experience of growing up in the west was very important. However, I do have this ongoing and, to be honest, quite wonderful association with Edinburgh, not just in last week's concerts, but I came here to study. Came here and was a very happy undergraduate here at Edinburgh University and studied at the Reed School. I got married here in George Square, and I wanted to read a little bit, since we're in Edinburgh and the Edinburgh Festival have marked me so generously this year. I want to read a little reflection about my time in Edinburgh and in those early days as an undergraduate. During my first days as a fresher in Edinburgh, I met Father Aidan Nichols, OP. He was the Catholic chaplain to the university, aged about 27 at the time, and he asked me to form a scola, which is a choir, to sing at the student masses. He was to become one of the most important academic theologians in the English-speaking world and would author dozens of important and influential books. His very first book, The Art of God Incarnate, Theology and Image in Christian Tradition, was dedicated to the undergraduate me, amico dilecto in Christo. In 1978, he organized a summer tour to France for our choir, which by this time had acquired the ridiculously grand title of Scola Sancti Alberti Magni, after St. Albert the Great, who is the patron of the Dominican Priory in George Square, Edinburgh. This sojourn has since been known as the Scola Disaster Tour. We hired 2 minibuses from the University of Edinburgh, and by the time we had reached the Midlands, heading south to the Channel crossings, we had crashed one into the other. They were both write-offs. We had to begin again. Hiring 2 new minibuses at Dover, we crossed on the ferry, but by the time we reached Calais, the big end had gone in one of them. We were stranded, a choir of 30 with one 15-seater minibus between us, with concerts looming in the next few days around northern France. We had to borrow a lot of money from the various Dominican and Benedictine establishments we were staying at in Paris and elsewhere to limp around from one place to the next, half of us travelling unexpectedly by train. One concert that sticks in the mind was in Solesmes, a commune in the department of Sarthe. It is famous for its Benedictine monastery, which from the early 20th century has been central to the renewal and spread of Gregorian chant, its related musicology and liturgy. The men of our choir were housed in monastery guest rooms. The women were all in a communal dormitory just outside the monastery grounds, as is the way in traditional Benedictine establishments. And I'm afraid to say that the men were treated royally by the monks, dined and wined in the refectory, while the women had to fend for themselves. One night, they had to share one chicken between the 15 of them. We realized that there might be some tension when they found out how well we had feasted. So we smuggled out bits of nougat from the end of the dinner to share with them. It was not appreciated.
James, you've always drawn great inspiration from your own Catholic faith and your own Christian faith. You once wrote or said that music is the most spiritual of the arts. It forges a connection with the hidden crevices between the relationship of the divine and the human. It gets into those cracks, which I think is a wonderful way of describing it. Have you always found this connection between music and the sacred or the spiritual?
I have, although it's become more acute in recent years. And in fact, that quote, and I use similar language quite a lot to describe what I think is this relationship between music and the sacred, has grown out of conversations and observations I've made with my fellow lovers of music, regardless of their religion. And in the world of music, I find many who are not conventionally religious like me perhaps, who will use the word spiritual to account for the impact that music has on their lives. If they love music so much that they give over their lives to absorbing it and to engaging with it, there is a kind of obedience of listening involved. That means a kind of sacrificing of time, putting aside part of our special time to engage with this strange, amorphous, unphysical thing called music, which gets into the crevices of the soul, as you say. And I've noticed that many agnostic and even atheist music lovers who share the love of music that I have will sometimes use this almost spiritual language to account for the kind of impact it has on their lives, in the way that it can be transformative. It can change them. It can bring about transformations in the way that they see the world, in the way that they build their relationships, in the way that they cope with events and developments in their lives. And I suppose what we're all doing, whether believers or not, when we're talking about music in that way, is accounting for a truth, that there is something in this music that allows us to see ourselves as more than just the sum of our parts, allows us to see life as something beyond us, and the special things in life as something very special indeed. And we also know, and we were talking earlier, that religion can be quite a divisive thing, and especially in these days, one way or another. But when when we talk about these things in relation to music, the divisions dissolve and we find common ground. And I find that quasi-theological language that many of us will use to account for music as something that we can share when it comes to music, in the sense that it has that deep, profound importance for us. The other thing maybe I should like to point out is that from the 20th century, when at a time when you expect religion and indeed the search for the sacred, if you like, to be disappearing from the arts, that has not happened in music, and I'm sure others could account for some of the other arts as well, and certainly my literary colleagues will have very interesting things to say about the search for the sacred in poetry, for example. But in music, when you think about it, some of the most major figures of modernity have been, in their different ways, profoundly spiritual and indeed even religious men and women. Stravinsky was a believer. He set the Mass, he set the Psalms. He was as conservative in his theology as he was revolutionary in his music making. Schoenberg, that other great pillar of early modernism, reconverted to a practicing Judaism after he left Germany, and his later work is infused with Jewish character, Jewish theology, Jewish life. And these are cutting-edge figures of modernism. John Cage went to study with Schoenberg. He deliberately sought out Schoenberg and saw in him a fellow mystic. And Cage found his own ways, circuitous perhaps, on the search of the sacred through the ideas and indeed the religions of the Far East. There's this incredible, strange and controversial piece of his called 433, which is 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence, which is a kind of provocation to our listening sensitivities or lack of them. The original title for that was, of course, Silent Prayer. And then, of course, there's Olivier Messiaen, profoundly theological in his work, the great French composer. Many of the composers that came after Shostakovich from behind the Iron Curtain, Goretzky, Arvo Pärt, Schnutke, all profoundly religious. Even in our country, Benjamin Britten maintained his links with the Judeo-Christian tradition and indeed the church, and wrote liturgy, although he sort of drifted into agnosticism, as many do. So instead of the search for the sacred being having vacated our culture in music, it's actually there at the very center of it, and it's there in many, many different ways that binds us together.
Some people have, and quite recently indeed, been saying that classical music is elitist, only appeals to certain kinds of people. And I know you've been involved in that debate yourself.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
Well, it's just not true. I mentioned my grandfather earlier. As I said, he was a coal miner, spent 50 years or more under the ground, hacking away at coal and the rest of it. But he lived for music, any music, but he had a love of the classics and what he knew of them. And when I came along, he was delighted that I was interested too, and he got me my first cornet, took me to my first band practices at Dunmellington. He got me my first organ tutors and hymn books, and eventually I was playing at church and so on. And Cumnock in East Ayrshire was full of men and women like my grandfather. There was not a lot of money around. There was genuine poverty in places like Cumnock through the 20th century and even in my childhood. But these people loved music. They lived for music. Those communities were infused with a search for good amateur music making. They sang in church choirs. They sang in local Amdram organizations. They put on performances of Judas Maccabeus, I remember hearing and playing in that with local people when I was a boy. Gilbert and Sullivan, the band culture, the silver band culture, which made some great musicians in Scotland. John Wallace, for example, came out of the brass band culture in Fife, from a working class background like mine, and he eventually became principal trumpeter in the Philharmonia and with the London Sinfonietta. In fact, there was a time in the 70s and 80s, most of the brass sections of the British orchestras were made up of sons of miners from coalfields in West Lothian and Fife and so on, and the north of England. So I know that music has this deep reach beyond the usual caricatures that are made. There was a very strange, anonymous editorial in The Guardian a few weeks ago which accused classical music and the classical music world of being elitist, etc., etc. And I was asked to write a response piece to this, which both attracted a lot of attention, and there was a lot of outrage amongst musicians, because especially in this country, musicians come from and have come from quite humble backgrounds, and I know that music works in these communities and can be made to work again in those communities. And to argue this rather simplistic view is to take a very defeatist view, and it harms those of us who are trying to spread the word to new generations. And also those of us who are involved in classical music know that it is a culture that unites the generations. So aging musicians like myself are very important to young people coming through. And if there are cutbacks in government funding and local council funding that hit the poorest off, and so that the poorest in our societies don't get access to music, then that will be a national scandal, and that will hit our music culture very hard.
Yeah. Here we are in a book festival, a musician talking in a literary festival. It's very interesting, the interplay between the different arts, isn't it, and how music takes its part in that. I remember in my previous church here in Edinburgh, Old St Paul's, when Alison Watt, one of our great artists, created a great work of art for the church, how it inspired Alan Spence, one of our great poets, to write some words, and inspired John Kitchen, a great musician, to set that to music, how the arts came together.
Yes.
You mentioned your working relationship with Michael Symonds Roberts, the poet. What first drew you to his work, and what's it like setting it to music?
Well, I suppose, first of all, the fundamental thing to be said about music, in contradistinction to some of the other arts, is that it is essentially an abstract form. Before anything else, it's the notes on the page and how those notes that are moved about the page that makes it, it gives it its power, its mysterious power. It communicates according to its own stuff, its own abstract parameters. And that's why there's such a pride amongst musicians, that there's a completeness, a self-sufficiency about music that can communicate profoundly. Having said that, though, we also know that music can enter into dialogue and enter into collaboration with the other arts, and that is fascinating too. Music can paint pictures. It can tell stories, and it's not just the 19th century symphonic poem tradition that has allowed music that facility. And of course, when you set words, either in song or in opera or in oratorio, there again one is entering into the realm of collaboration. And I've always been looking for words to set, whether they're traditional and ancient, such as scripture, or indeed in the work of the living poet. And Michael Symonds Roberts is a little younger than I, but I was attracted by his work, and I saw that sense of the sublime in the everyday, which made it so beautiful, so that the sense of the sacred that I mentioned can suddenly surprise you in a poem by Michael Symonds Roberts, because it doesn't read like a sacred text. It reads like a poem very much of our own time, and of the little things in our life and the small things in our life. And we eventually started working together. And in fact, one of our big collaborations came to Edinburgh last Saturday, so a week past on Saturday, which was the big oratorio Quickening.
Yes.
And Michael came up for that, and Michael came on stage with me to take a bow. And because there are parallels between the world of poetry and music, but essentially because they are very different, I've always found the company and advice and direction that I get from the likes of Michael Symonds Roberts very important.
So his work inspired you, your own faith has inspired you as a composer. Are there any other sources of inspiration? I'm actually thinking about football.
Well, composers can be inspired by the strangest things. Sometimes they're profound and serious, and that's happened to me quite a bit, I suppose, and some of the works I've been talking about. But sometimes the silly and the mundane can be equally inspiring. And you mentioned football. I'm not the only composer that has been inspired by the beautiful game. Did you know, for example, that Shostakovich was a Leningrad Zenit fan?
Yes.
And there are wonderful photographs of him at the games actually smiling. And that's something you never actually see with Shostakovich. He usually had a very miserable face, for reasonable reasons, of course, but he seemed to come alive when he went to see Leningrad Zenit play. And then, of course, Mark Anthony Turnage, who's a contemporary of mine, has written works inspired by his team, Arsenal. And he's worked in some of the football chants into his orchestral music, and indeed his operas. There's a piece by a Czech composer, his name's just gone out of my head just now, called Half Time, inspired by the team that he supported, Sparta Prague. And so it goes on. In fact, the piece I've written pieces as well inspired by these silly things, and one of them is a piano concerto called the Berserking, and it was inspired by a Celtic Partizan Belgrade game, which Celtic lost 5-4, but because of the away goals rule, they had lost over in Belgrade. They went out 5-4 in aggregate, but the away goals count double. So I can honestly and proudly say that I'm the only composer in the history of music who has written a piano concerto inspired by the away goals rule.
Yes, indeed, yes. I don't know how many people would note that you said that football belonged to the prosaic and the mundane. That might not be agreed with by some of the keener fans. Thinking about your own inspiration, though, coming into music, and the things that inspired you as a child. You mentioned your grandfather, and some of that. How would you say you learned the art of composition?
Well, like many British school children, probably today as well, but certainly in the 1960s, I was handed a little plastic recorder when I was about 9 years old by Miss Gray, and it turned out to be one of the most important days of my life. It's not the seismic moment for most people, I suppose, but for me it was like a light going on, because it pointed me immediately in new directions. I moved on to other instruments quite quickly, but I knew, or I felt within just a few days of getting my fingers round about some of the notes, I think B, A, and G were the first three notes I learned, that I wanted to not just play the instrument, but write for it. And I began scribbling. I didn't have notation at that stage, but just writing combinations of these three pitches, 4 or 5 pitches eventually, into little melodies. So something had happened even by that stage. And because of my grandfather's discussions about music, I knew quickly there were these strange people called composers, and my mother had played the piano as a teenager. In fact, the house was still full of her old piano books. I gradually started finding hidden boxes and things, Beethoven piano sonatas that my mum had played, some Chopin and so on. So suddenly I was surrounded by music that had hidden in boxes and in shelves for a while, and I started asking questions about them. Who was Beethoven? And of course my mum and my grandfather and others were able to tell me and point me in the direction of their music, and I started listening. But I became beguiled by some of their life stories as well, especially Beethoven's actually. And there was something about that romantic life story that appealed to me. I didn't know what it would mean, though, at such an early stage, what it would mean to be a composer later in life. But certainly a light had gone on, and as I say, it began simultaneously with actually holding an instrument.
In the book, you write at the end very movingly about the tragic and sad experience in your family of losing your granddaughter Sarah last year. A very painful experience that and you wrote very wonderfully about it. That must have been, for many people, that would be a so devastating experience they couldn't contemplate faith or creativity.
Yeah.
But you wrote about it quite differently.
Yes, well, I do talk about this. I did a Desert Island Discs thing after Sarah died, and I talked about it then. I realised I had to talk about it, and I've written about Sarah in the book. You never get over anything like that, and I'm sure there are people here that have had similar experiences, whether it's losing a child, a grandchild, or someone beloved. You never get over it, but it's true what they say, that in a sense time does heal. And our daughter, the mother of of little Sarah, has come back to live with us, and we hunkered down, of course, and tried to cope with the fiercest grief in the early days. And I can see even my daughter's life beginning to emerge chrysalis-like from something very dark, and we're all like that. But for a composer, wow, I was writing music within weeks of this happening, and it was inescapable that the experience of that would leave its mark. And I certainly can hear, I think, little Sarah in the silences, and I talk about silence in the context of death and loss and music towards the end of the book. And well, maybe these things have a huge effect on an artist in ways that we can't quite fathom to begin with, and I'm sure the experience will have left its mark in me.
Yeah. Thank you for that. But you've often, as well, you end the book with silence, and I've heard you speak about silence before.
Yeah.
For a musician, relation to silence, how does that feel?
Well, it's a curious thing, isn't it? All that noise that we make, and yet silence is so important, and not just for John Cage. There are many composers throughout history, but perhaps interestingly more in our own time, who have reflected on silence. Schoenberg was a mystic who was obsessed with silence. And there's something about it, because it's in the silence of our own hearts, the silence of our own brains and souls, that the music begins. And it's a philosophical reflection, because there is apparent absence in those silences. There is certainly no music, but we all feel, composers, a kind of umbilical link with silence. It's the music begins, germinates in the apparent nothingness, the apparent nihil of those silences, which makes us reflect. Certainly, it's made me reflect on what silence is, silence can be a kind of breeding ground for many things, including music. There's actually a symphony of mine, my third symphony, which is subtitled Silence, and it was inspired by Shusaku Endo's marvelous book Shinmoku, which is Silence. It's recently been made into a film directed by Martin Scorsese. I haven't brought myself to see the film yet, because the violence of the book was difficult enough. But it's apart from the nature of the story, Endo focuses on this. And for him, the silence is the apparent absence of God. And it's again a wonderful book that brings together believers, agnostics, atheists, unbelievers, to reflect on one of the great existential questions: why are we here? But also, where is God? Some come to conclusions that He's not there, and certainly that's one of the questions that Endo asks throughout the book, faced with the terrible manifestations of human evil. It's the question that was asked in Auschwitz, and I'm sure will be asked for centuries to come. Where is God in all of this? And he doesn't offer any conclusions, but he tantalizingly suggests that it is in that absence of God or sound or music, there is a sense of accompaniment, and that Endo was a convert to Christianity, and his suggestion is that in those silences, God accompanies us on his own Via Doloroso. So he's with us through Auschwitz, he's with us through persecution and Holocaust, paradoxically, in his own experience and his own desire to be human like us.
You've reached the age of 60, a young age for many of us here. When you look forward now to the next decade, are you working on anything at the moment? What do you hope for in terms of music?
Well, it has given me a lot of reflection. I remember having a similar feeling when I was 30. So maybe these things go in 30-year cycles. At 30, it was simply, I haven't done anything yet. I need to get a move on. And by 60, I realised I have done a lot, but I'm taking this time to reflect on what I've done and to think ahead. I'd like to be here in 30 years' time and still writing. A great inspiration for me is Elliot Carter, who lived right up to the age of 103 and wrote to the day before he died. So if I could be like that, that'd be wonderful. But it's given me pause for thought to consider what I might be writing. Maybe not in the next, maybe not in 30 years' time, but certainly in the next few years. I want to get back to writing chamber music. There is something about writing quartets which allows a composer to get to the essence of oneself and perhaps even the existential questions that we ask ourselves, and which I've touched on already. One is exposed by the sparseness of the four instruments. It's the notes and nothing but the notes. You can't hide, and it's terrifying, but it's perhaps something that we all have to do. I've written a number, 3 or 4 quartets, but I need to get back to writing more, and there are 2 of those works looming in the next few years. I've written 2 passion settings so far, a St. John and a St. Luke. So my mind turns to Mark and Matthew over the next couple of decades perhaps. But at the moment I'm in the middle of writing a Christmas oratorio. It's for Christmas next year. And it's quite odd sitting in the middle of summer thinking Jingle Bells or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But that's been fascinating, and it's been a delight to do, because I've had to make it up as I go along, in the sense it's not a liturgical work in the way that Bach's Christmas oratorio and the various cantatas that made it up were. So I'm having to find my own texts. Some of them are scriptural, but some of them are simply poetic, so I'm able to get back into the great English spiritual poetry, people like Robert Southwell and John Donne. So I'm making that work. It's a full evening's work, and the first performance will be with the London Philharmonic Orchestra next Christmas in London, and hopefully it will come to Scotland too, of course.
Well, we have a lot to look forward to. Now we're going to move into time now when people can ask questions of Sir James. If you'd wait till you have the microphone in your hand, and there are people going to be coming around with them, when you have the microphone, just indicate and I'll try and catch sight of you, and please ask your question. Who's first? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir James. And just to say how much we've enjoyed the performances at the festival, and particularly the world premiere. It was totally thrilling.
Thank you.
You talked about your inspiration from your grandfather and Miss Gray, the teacher, but there must have been somebody or some set of people who helped you to find the pathway into composing in a more formal sense. Who were they?
Well, very good question. I deliberately chose to come to study here in Edinburgh in the late 1970s at the University of Edinburgh because of who was Professor of Music at the time. His name was Kenneth Layton, one of the great English composers, I think, very much in the tradition of Benjamin Britten and others. And I had heard his music and heard about him through school teachers. And I have an old friend at Paisley Abbey, George McPhee, who's still alive and now still working with the choir and doing the music at the Abbey into his 50th year. And he advocated a lot for Kenneth Layton's music. And it turned out, in fact, that Kenneth Layton was a wonderful teacher. And I've talked about Kenneth in the book. He was very traditional in his approach to teaching. We did fundamental practical work. The study of counterpoint was absolutely essential for me, studying species counterpoint, learning to imitate the great contrapuntalists of the past, like Palestrina, but also Bird and Gibbons, fugal expositions in the style of Bach. I mean, this might sound quite dry, and I know that many musicians did find it dry, but I loved it. I lapped it up because I was learning something about the basics, the fundamentals about how complexity works, how line against line works. And of course, I don't want my music to sound like any of these composers. You don't want to imitate the masters of the past, but you can learn so much from them. And as far as complexity is concerned, you can learn even the principles of not just line against line, but rhythm against rhythm, harmony against harmony, and the whole complexity thing can take off. And Kenneth was a marvelous teacher in that sense, very quiet, very traditional, very serious. And after here I went to study at the University of Durham, where my teacher was John Caskin, who's a younger figure, and he was a very humane and brilliant teacher too. So Kenneth and John and people like him were absolutely fundamentally important for me.
Okay, who's next?
Thank you. I went recently, a few years ago, to Berlin with the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. And we went to two very good performances, two orchestra performances. And after the first one, I said to one of the players, "What is the job of a conductor?" To which he said, "That's a good question." And then I went up to somebody else and said, "What's the job of a conductor?" To which he said, "That's a very good question. Can you tell me what the answer is?"
Well, I can understand why people would want to avoid answering it, because perhaps we don't know. I certainly don't know, and I've been conducting for some years. It is a black art, I must admit, and I watch the great conductors of our time and wonder what on earth they are doing to produce what the magic that they produce. And I sometimes am bold enough to ask them, but they never tell me. If they've got secrets, they keep them to themselves. I'm actually reading a wonderful book just now by Mark Wrigglesworth, who is a student of mine, actually, not a conducting student. He's become an amazing conductor, but he explores these mysteries. I would heartily recommend it. Because he tries to explore what it is, and he says there might be something in the physicality of the figure at the front of the orchestra, the shape of the individual, which is quite worrying. But I think it's more than that. It's something about the power of the will, the way that the personality is able to control. There's a difficult word, an unavoidable and unpopular word now, exert authority, and it's a group authority, because orchestras and choirs can be quite unruly ensembles sometimes, and if you cannot command the support and indeed the respect of a very large group of people, you've no chance of doing it. I know that's not answering your question, but I continue to probe the question myself, and hopefully I'll just keep trying my best as a conductor.
Maybe it's like the title of the Fifth Symphony, which is Le Grand Inconnu.
Yeah.
Next question. There's one right at the back there.
Yeah.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about when you complete a work, that sense of evaporation, giving the impression that you looked at your composing in a kind of a singular, a linear way. But I wonder if you, with all these the things that are happening during the night and so on, if that's actually how your creative process works, or is it more like an artist that has a number of canvases on the go at one time? Do you think that something might come to you that may fit into something that you're working on at the time, or that you set that by, or you're working on one or two things simultaneously?
Yes, it is possible for me to do a couple of things simultaneously, but there always has to be one big focus and maybe some peripheral focuses. So at the moment it's the Christmas Oratorio, but I broke off momentarily to write, here's this plug that we were asked to give, to write a little piece that's going to be performed here on Monday night. The Hebrides Ensemble is involved in performance of a number of composers' works, which are the settings of the last lines of books. And I chose the last line of Orwell's 1984. So I've set that for voice and a couple of instruments. And it was a diversion from the Christmas Oratorio. It was a very different kind of piece. But sometimes those little diversions, those times off, as it were, are just what you need, just to allow you to refresh your thoughts and then get back to the bigger thing. So that can happen. The little diversions can be just as important as anything else. The thoughts in the middle of the night are also important, and I do believe that the subconscious, as well as the haunted wakened hours of the night, are important. And sometimes, as in other things, compositional problems can be solved just with a night's sleep. That one can go to bed not knowing how to develop this idea. I'm involved in the 7th movement of part 1 just now of the Christmas Oratorio, and I'm genuinely struggling with a couple of ideas, but I can feel them settling down as days turn into weeks and solutions emerge from that. As you live with your material more and more, and you begin to see connections between opposites, and perhaps doing something with idea A that could work in tandem with idea B, and maybe idea B can be transformed back into idea A. And these things don't happen overnight, and they certainly don't happen in an instant. They can indeed take a while, and so one has to be patient. Some things do come in an instant, and some things come in a flash of quite vivid, fierce inspiration. And then other things, it's not like that at all. So no second day, no day is similar for me.
Are you going to be one of the last symphonic composers?
Am I going to be one of the last symphonic composers? I hope not. I've actually, for the Saturday night's concert, I wrote quite a substantial essay in the booklet, which began with exploring the symphony in our times. And I've noticed that there are composers who want to write symphonies, or at least will use the word symphony to describe a work, and there are those who are very loath to do that. But it's interesting to see the ones who have used it. Maxwell Davies wrote 10 symphonies. Schnittke wrote 9 or 10. Tippett wrote 4. Henze wrote 10, I think. The great Russian composer whose work I admire, Galina Ustvolskaya, who was a student of Shostakovich, wrote about 6. But her symphonies are strange. One of her 5th symphony is just 10 minutes long and scored for 5 instruments and a narrator speaking the Lord's Prayer in Russian. That's not your idea of a symphony, but yet it was a symphony for her. When Stravinsky wrote his symphonies of wind instruments, again it's a 12-minute piece, and it reduced its English audience at the premiere in London to hysterics when it was first performed, because they'd never heard anything like it. But for him, the word symphony, or symphonies, perhaps in the ancient sense of things sounding together, was important to him. So there are different ways and different re-evaluations of the word, whether in the singular or the plural. I think many composers will find their way back to the concept one way or another. So
Last very quick question. There's a gentleman right in the
middle of the row.
Yeah.
Sir James, thank you very much for giving us a wonderful insight into the artist's mind. But even more, thank you very much for writing so much wonderful, challenging, and thoroughly enjoyable music. We owe you a huge great debt for that.
That's very kind. Thank you very much.
If I can go back to one of the earlier questions, recently from the proms, there was a broadcast of Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, the original version, which took me completely by surprise. It has been common practice, I think, amongst many composers to go back over old work, revise and renew. I just wonder how big is the temptation for you to do that?
Very good question, and I also heard that broadcast, and it was a revelation to hear a work that many of us thought we knew and loved hearing, sounding very, very different indeed. And I was aware that there had been an original of Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, but I hadn't realized it was like an entirely different world altogether. The mood is darker, the developments are very different, and he obviously did a huge amount of revision on that. He rethought the piece from scratch, or so it seemed. And I've sometimes revisited works, but certainly not in that wholesale way. Maybe in years to come, I might go back and find things that I might want to rework. The one work that I did revise quite significantly was my opera, Inês de Castro, which I wrote for Scottish Opera. I wrote that for the 1996 performance, and I had no idea what I was doing. It was the first opera, real opera as it were, I had written, and I was just chancing my way with it. I knew the operas that I loved. I knew what had made me want to be a composer. The works of Wagner, for example. I saw Götterdämmerung when I was 12, for example. I'm coming back to see it on Sunday. Can't wait, in fact. That was an experience that made me want to be a composer too, hearing it in the early 1970s, conducted by Alexander Gibson. But when I wrote my Inês de Castro, I dedicated the Inês to Alexander Gibson because of the impact he had had on my young life as a composer. But I knew that there were things in the first opera that hadn't quite gone right, certain word settings and certain scorings that might have been too thick to allow the voice through. Some of the drama wasn't tight enough. So when Scottish Opera asked me to, they brought it back in a new production a few years ago, I took the opportunity to make quite significant revisions. I cut a whole scene, for example, from Act 1, which just held up the drama. I rescored some things to allow the voices to get through, did some new scorings, and changed some of the word setting as well, just to allow us to hear the words that little bit better. So it did feel as if the older composer by that stage was checking and sorting the work of the younger composer.
Well, I'm afraid we need to draw the double bar on this delightful symphony of conversation. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience, and especially those who've asked questions, but all of you as well, and remind you that Sir James will now be available to sign copies of his book, A Scots Song, A Life of Music, in the signing tent immediately after the session concludes. But above all, I'd like to thank with you a man who doesn't like the title that was awarded him in the programme by the Edinburgh International Book Festival, but I think we'd all agree that Sir James MacMillan is the true titan of Scottish classical music.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.